उनकी व्यवस्था
A very warm welcome to all those who have joined our webinar today on the rise of Russia
kindly unmute yourself
in global politics, a view from Pakistan. As we all know, when the Soviet Union unraveled in December 1991, we saw the downscaling of Russia in world politics. Vladimir Putin described the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century for the Russian people. But in recent times, the world has seen the reassertion of Russia as an important player in world politics. In various parts of the world, in Europe, the Middle East, and far-flung corners of the world, like Africa, Latin America, and Asia. We have three distinguished panelists for this webinar. Ambassadors Shahid Amin and Ambassador Hassan Habib, and also Dr Tanweer Khalid. The first speaker is Ambassador Shahid Amin. He is one of the most distinguished diplomats that Pakistan has ever had, and he has served in the missions of our country in Saudi Arabia, in France, Nigeria, and Libya. He was also posted in New Delhi, Kabul, Tehran, Brussels, London, and New York. But most important of all, he was our ambassador to the Soviet Union. He has a distinct worldview. His first book was entitled Pakistan's Foreign Policy, a Reappraisal, but he has been a prolific writer on foreign policy and international affairs. I was particularly engaged with his work on reminiscences of a Pakistani diplomat. Ambassador Shahid Amin will speak on Russia from Gorbachev to Putin. Each panelist has 15 to 20 minutes. And after they have all spoken, we will have a question and answer session. Ambassador Shahid Amin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Masood Hassan. It's a great pleasure to be participating in this webinar arranged by the Pakistan Institute of International Affairs. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Shahid sir, we can't hear you.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I
You
can hear you.
me? Okay,
Yes.
fine. I'll go ahead now. Okay. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Yes, I was ambassador to the Soviet Union from 1984 to 88, 3 years of Gorbachev. I saw the policies which would probably be the main cause for the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Our subject is rise of Russia, and perhaps we should first mention some basic facts about Russia, which has every reason to be a great power. Look at the size. It is the largest area in the world. It has 11 time zones. Russia contains over 30% of the world's natural resources. It is the world's largest, it has the world's largest gas reserves and is the leading gas exporter of the world. It has the second largest coal reserve. Can you hear me? Dr. Masuma, can you hear me?
No, I can't hear you.
How come?
Yes, I can hear you.
Dr. Tanveer can hear me.
Yeah, yes,
Ambassador
I can.
Hassan, can you hear me?
No, I can't hear you.
She can't hear me, so please arrange something.
Doesn't matter, you carry on.
Anyway, I'll continue. So, as I was saying, it has the world's largest natural resources, including it is the third largest producer of wheat in the world. It has 1/5 of the world's timber. It is the third largest gold producer in the world. So with this kind of background, it is no surprise that Russia has been a great power for the last 400, 500 years. But this is where maybe we can begin our discussion. In 1917, the communists seized power in Russia and the Soviet Union emerged, which will continue till 1991. And under Stalin, the country was transformed into an industrialized state. Soviet Union was the first to reach the space. It developed a huge armory of nuclear weapons and ICBMs. And after 1945, it emerged as a superpower. Unfortunately, then a Cold War began, which lasted till 1991, with the communist bloc being led by the Soviet Union and the Western bloc led by the USA. It was a very dangerous confrontation since both sides possessed weapons of mass destruction. And it is very fortunate for the world that matters never reached that point. But certainly the world lived in great fear of a nuclear holocaust. That would end with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, when USA emerged as the sole superpower. The Soviet Union, as I said, had made remarkable progress, but that was done through an apparatus of coercion and regimentation. Soviet Union was a total dictatorship. There was no freedom of expression, no freedom of the press, no freedom of association. Even the so-called freedom of religion was confined to a symbolic show of religion. Otherwise, religion was repressed. I know from personal knowledge, Muslims told me that anybody found in possession of a copy of the Quran was sure to get a jail sentence, if not worse. So this was the state of affairs. We can say that the Soviet rule, the communist rule, did have some positives. Of course, I mentioned how through industrialization, it achieved so much progress that it was the first in space and became a superpower. Some other positives during the communist rule should be mentioned. Illiteracy was practically eradicated. There was free medical and education. There was very little unemployment. There was very little crime. Women received equality in, at least in the workforce. Of course, no woman ever made it to the top of the leadership. But by and large, we can say women seem to be equal participants in the society. And I would also say there was not much evidence of any racism like you have in the European countries. And one proof that is that two of the top communist leaders and Khrushchev are not Russian. One was from Georgia and the other was from Ukraine. So this was one of the good features of communism. Of course, as I said, it was a total the state controlled everything. The secret police was watching everyone. There was thought control. Conformity was the system. Everybody had to conform. Every election produced 99% votes in favor of the ruling party. So this was the Soviet Union. Then, of course, it would collapse without a shot being fired in 1991. And I can say when I was there, 84 to 88, nobody really ever expected this to happen. Of course, now in hindsight, people always come up with theories that they were predicting this and that. But as far as I recall, I was there till 1988 and nobody predicted the imminent collapse of the Soviet Union, but it came. So I think we should try to identify why. Why did the Soviet Union collapse? I think there were basically, of course, there were many reasons, but I would identify two main reasons. One was stagnation of the economy and, in fact, decline of the economy. The Soviet economy did well, say from 1924 till 1960, but that was through regimentation, even slave labor, and the exploitation of the immense resources of the Soviet Union. But by 1960, a kind of a plateau had been reached, and by 1980, economic decline had started. And that was partially due to the arms race with the West, in which the Soviet Union seemed to be at a disadvantage. The West could put up with that increase in arms expenditure, but the Soviet Union, with its weak economy, was getting left behind. And of course, there was also increasing corruption. With the passing of time, there was increasing corruption. In fact, lack of incentives, absence of competition, centralized bureaucratic control. There was great wastage. There was a command economy. Projects were undertaken without feasibility because the leadership wanted it. There was actually poverty in Russia. And the unfortunate part was that educated people like professors, engineers, doctors were paid less than truck drivers because they wanted to prove that this is the rule of the workers and the peasants. And there was no incentive to do excel because promotion did not come that way. So finally, the system just started to come to a stop. The denial of economic laws and market forces could not be sustained over a long period of time. Finally, the truth caught up. And this became a key reason for the collapse. The second reason, of course, was that it was a repressive system, especially under Stalin. But even after Stalin died, although the leaders denounced Stalin for his excesses, but the repressive system continued. And I can say from my own day in 84, people just were scared of talking to each other. Even parents were scared of talking to their children. So once glasnost, which I'll discuss now, started and freedom of speech was gradually allowed, it was like letting the genie out of the bottle. All the repression built up over the years suddenly came out like an unstoppable flood and overwhelmed the Soviet system. And since then, the fact that the Communist Party has very little appeal in that country, although the communist doctrines taught from kindergarten to the highest stages from 1917 to 1991 shows how little people believed in the communist system and the communist ideology. Now I come to Gorbachev, who we can say that he's mainly responsible for the way the collapse came so early. It would have come probably at some stage, but it was hastened by Gorbachev. And who is this Gorbachev? I happen to have met Gorbachev and I met Yeltsin. I can say I have some personal experience. He was a very bright person intellectually. In fact, we can call him an intellectual. He was a committed communist. He had come up in the communist system. There is no question about that. Some people doubt his communist credential. No, he was a committed communist. But he belonged to the reformist group which emerged around 1980 in the Communist Party, first led by Andropov, who became the general secretary for 2 years, 82 to 84. And then in 1985, Gorbachev took over, and there was great expectations from him that he is dynamic, he's full of ideas, he was very articulate. There was no doubt he was very articulate. So great hopes were raised and he set out, I think, we can say his objective was to reinvigorate communism, to improve the economy, to remove the corruption which had got built in the system during Brezhnev's days. Brezhnev turned out to be very corrupt, at least in his later years. So this was a kind of a reformist agenda, and Gorbachev came out with two policies which basically bear his hallmark. One was called glasnost. Glasnost ka matlab meaning is political openness. And the second one was economic. It was called perestroika, which will translate as economic restructuring. Now take glasnost. One won't say that suddenly full freedom of expression was allowed, but certainly a process started towards freedom of expression and freedom of the press and even finally multi-party elections. Gorbachev was very confident that this will help to rejuvenate the party, but in fact the opposite happened. As I said, the years of repression were waiting for some escape, and he had opened the bottle from which the genie came out and overwhelmed everybody, including Gorbachev himself. The second pillar of his policy was the perestroika, and under that he loosened state control. Even private initiative was allowed. Business ownership was given at least in some form. Foreign investment was being encouraged. But all of this eventually destabilized the communist system. It was, as I said, a control economy. And now the controls are being taken away. So these were the two main reasons I think which would lead to the collapse. But to add to that, we should add a few more. Cold War pressures, the arms race, which was having a crippling effect on the Soviet economy. Then the failed war in Afghanistan, in which Pakistan also played a role. His famous word, you might remember, where Gorbachev said, I think in 1986, that Afghanistan has become a bleeding wound for the Soviet Union, an ulcer. It was hurting the Soviet Union, and moreover, the war was exceedingly unpopular in the Soviet Union. And this, I think, should be given as one more reason why the Soviet Union would finally collapse. Then, in the same spirit of openness, when rebellion started in East Europe, the satellite countries, the satellite communist countries in East Europe, Gorbachev, unlike his predecessor Brezhnev, who had this famous Brezhnev doctrine under which Soviet Union could intervene militarily whenever there was a rebellion in East Europe, but not Gorbachev. He did not apply that. And then a kind of a snowballing situation developed from one country to another. East Europe started to assert independence. The Berlin Wall fell. And then something even more dangerous happened from the Soviet point of view. So far, the trouble is coming in the satellite countries, but now within the Soviet Union itself, rebellion started. And by 1991, out of the 15 republics of the Soviet Union, republic is the same word as province, out of the 15 republics of the Soviet Union, 14 had broken away. Plus, they were, even inside the Russian Federation, in Chechnya and some other Muslim areas, there was either an open revolt or at least some signs of serious unrest. So the Soviet Union was also disintegrating from within. And then, of course, the multi-party elections were allowed by Gorbachev in 1990, which destabilized communist control. There was an attempt made by the hardliners to stop this. And Gorbachev, there was an attempted coup d'etat against Gorbachev in August 1991. But Yeltsin, we'll now come to Yeltsin, who started as a strong supporter of Gorbachev's program of reform, of glasnost. And then, in a way, he outdistanced his own mentor. In other words, he became critical of the slow pace of glasnost and perestroika, and developed differences with Gorbachev, who tried to oust him. In fact, he was removed from the Politburo, but Yeltsin's popularity kept increasing. He had a charismatic personality, and people saw him as standing against the status quo as a reformer. I think this is how he built his public image. And when there was this attempted coup against Gorbachev by the Communist Party hardliners, Yeltsin emerged in the limelight. He was the president of the Duma, the parliament. An attempt was made by the hardliners to storm the parliament with tanks, but the troops refused to open fire on their own fellow countrymen. And after 3 days, the coup collapsed. Gorbachev was restored, but now it is not Gorbachev who's the main source of power, it is Yeltsin. Power has passed to Yeltsin, and Gorbachev is really a shadow of himself. And the inevitable happened in December 1991. Gorbachev resigned and Yeltsin took over. The last words of Gorbachev as the president are, when he announced his resignation, they are worth repeating. He said that
Shahid Amin sir, would you like to wind up?
Will you allow me a few more minutes? Will
Okay,
you allow
how
me
many
a
more
few more
minutes?
minutes? Yeah, because
How many more minutes?
I think there is a story to tell. Uh, Basically, Gorbachev said that the old order has not quite ended and the new order has not come to surface. In other words, it was a very strange situation. And this is how Yeltsin took over. No doubt he was very popular, but the 1990s saw a period of uncertainty and instability. Why? Because the communist system, which had long ruled the Soviet Union for 70 years or so, uh, was set aside, and the market economy system was not easy to introduce in a country which was not used to it. And so the 1990s saw all kind of hardships for this Russian people, high inflation, sort of decline of the social services, joblessness, rising crime, political instability. All of this created great disaffection. Yeltsin, no doubt, maintained his popularity because he had risen as a kind of a people's favorite, and he had a charismatic personality. But by and large, I think his policies did not solve the issues of the Russian people. And in the end, I think he was losing popularity very fast. But he made, I think, one historically correct decision, which was he chose Putin out of obscurity. Putin was really a KGB agent, but he went to on under Yeltsin to become the head of the secret police, and that is how he came to the notice of Putin, who found him to be an energetic, dynamic person, and chose him firstly as the prime minister and then as the president. And this is how the Yeltsin years came to an end, and Putin came to power. And the reason for Putin's success is he built on basically the same policy. The private market system was continued, and he gave stability to the country and a kind of a stability in policies. And Russia has such enormous resources. Once you give stability to that country, there's no way it can be stopped from rising. And so this is the main reason for the success of Putin, and that the resources were there. All that was needed was to give political stability and stable leadership. And I think with the passing of time, the market economy system became acceptable. People understood how to work it out. And so when we talk of the rise of Russia, it is basically from the year 2000 because of the policy changes that I have mentioned. I'll end here, and I would be happy to answer questions if we have the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Shahid Amin. You have given a really sweeping panorama of what happened to Russia between Gorbachev and Putin. And I'm sure there will be many questions addressed to you. The next speaker is Ambassador Hassan Habib, who was our ambassador to North Korea. He has served in many countries as Pakistan's ambassador and also representative in other positions. Currently, he is senior fellow at the Center for Policy and Area Studies at the Institute of Business Management in Karachi. He is an author. He has written The Tragedy of North Korea and also many publications, including South China Sea, China Needs Friends, Are Emerging Alliances a Threat to the US, and also about the North Korean crisis, whether there is a chance for a diplomatic solution. Ambassador Hassan Habib will speak on Russia's Eurasian partnership. Ambassador sir.
Assalamu alaikum. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Yes, thank you. Assalamu alaikum. At the start, I would like to express my profound thanks to Dr. Masood Hassan and PIIA for providing me with this opportunity to express my views on this important topic. We are living in very difficult times. The geostrategic, geopolitical, and geoeconomic shifts are taking place at a pace that is frightening. I will first try to define our core area, that is what Eurasia is, and then move on to what options and or opposition Russia has in finally the prospects for Russia-Eurasian partnership. Eurasia is the largest continent on Earth with over 1/3 of planet's total area, and also it is most populous. It has tremendous natural resources from oil and gas to fresh water and fertile land. It has witnessed the oldest civilization that later spread to Asia, Africa, and elsewhere. It would be great for it to discard customs, tariffs, visa restrictions, mutual suspicion, grievances, and endless dispute to build on mutual understanding for the benefit of its people and rest of the world. Alas, the Eurasian continent continues to be disjointed, split into a number of fragments in terms of security, political, economy, science, and culture. At the moment, the concept of Eurasian identity is non-existent. Despite several attempts to achieve it, this disunity is due to internal and external factors. The Greater Eurasian Partnership concept developed or introduced by President Putin in late 2015 proceeds from the premise that the first step in this direction should be taken in the economic architecture rather than political or military sphere. It is pertinent to mention that the two most memorable attempts to unite Eurasia in the past, one by force, the Mongol Empire, and the other through trade, the Great Silk Route, proves that the trade ties generally are more useful. Consequently, Eurasian unification today should start with the economy. The partnership envisions consistent progress towards a network of free trade areas and inter-regional trade and economic alliances connecting it to the vast Eurasian spaces. This will be a very ambitious project of the 21st century and may take several decades to fully implement. In my view, important steps could be: first, the partnership should not be a potential competitor to the existing regional structures like ASEAN, RCEP, and the economic projects, BRI, or regional organizations like SCO, APEC, or ASEM. In fact, this should supplement the existing structures. Second, the partnership is not a union opposed to East or West. Thirdly, it should, in the run-up of the building towards this partnership, the differences among the parties in respect of model for their social, political, and economic development need to be accommodated. The partnership should be based on universally recognized norms of international law. Fourth, the partnership develops a flexible form involving individual states and the regional groups in its activity. Fifth, the partnership is focused on economic unification, but will naturally cover the cooperation areas such as science, education, culture, and humanitarian. Sixth, and the last, the building of Greater Eurasian Partnership should proceed by building on agreements between regional integration, unions, and individual states. The very concept of this partnership was put forward about 7 years ago, but it is still in a very nascent form. The bilateral cooperation between Russia and Chinese experts in international relations, economic, sociology, and security could play a very important role in this process. The possible resistance by US and EU have prompted Russia to pivot it to Asia. The possible and Moscow Its proposed GEP is meant to be a vehicle for connecting Europe and Asia with South Asia, including China, India, Japan, South Korea, and other ASEAN states. If geography is destiny, then Russia is fated to be world's greatest Eurasian power. The largest country in the world by far, it stretches from Pacific to Arctic Ocean and Barents Sea across a vast sweep of land, two-thirds of Asia and one-third in Europe. Its strategic location, natural resources, world-leading nuclear arsenal, and one of the greatest armed forces gives Russian state its authority and geopolitical muscle to play an important role in this. Russia historically has been a force of globalization. Communist country bloc in the 20th century, participation in World War, and now the European Eurasian Economic Union, EAEU, launched in 2015. This grouping brings together former Soviet states, including Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, with Moldova, Uzbekistan, and Cuba as observers. In short time, since its establishment, EAEU have signed free trade agreements with Serbia and the ASEAN members, Singapore and Vietnam, and an interim agreement with Iran. Free trade negotiation with Cambodia is completing. To this end, in 2016, President Putin had proposed greater economic partnership which aims to consolidate related integration projects from Vladivostok to Lisbon. Let us stop here and try to understand what lies behind GEP and what are the opportunities it offers, an obstacle that can hamper it. What political and economic benefit we can achieve from it, or Russia can achieve from it, and other members. Russia and other EAU members are geographically and logically the main bridge between Europe and Asia. But after the end of Cold War, differences between Russia and Europe have prevented any serious integration between European Union and EAEU and its leaders. So tension between Moscow and Washington has also been an impediment to closer ties. In this era of shifting world orders, Russia and China have deepened ties based on range of shared interests. The two countries need each other. Moscow supplies energy and natural resources to Chinese vast market, and China also requires Russian modern weaponry. Beijing and Moscow regard each other as a strategic partner in the struggle to counter Western dominance and to promote a multipolar world as an alternative to US-dominated international order. In 2015, Russia agreed with China to integrate EAEU and Belt and Road Initiative. 3 years later, Kazakhstan agreement on trade and economic cooperation between EAEU and People's Republic of China was signed. This accord sets out a roadmap for joining together EAEU and BRI. In September 2001, in a speech to Eastern Economic Forum, President Xi Jinping stressed the importance of deepening this development. A key forum for facilitating this goal has been Shanghai Cooperation Organization (SCO), which includes Russia, China, Central Asian states of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and also India, Pakistan, and Iran is recently included. The GAP framework is also meant to enhance further the harmonization of EAU integration projects with BRI. Both SCO and GEP serve as a platform for resolving differences and contradictory interests among participating countries. For example, the relationship between India and China, where Russia could think it would form a bridge between these two countries as it maintains good relations with both of them. In the eastward turn, Russia also harbors ambitions of deepening economic partnership with Japan and South Korea. Again, geopolitics have proven an obstacle. Long-running territorial dispute between Moscow and Tokyo over the Kuril Island and the strategic alliance of the two Asian countries with US. Russia stages military exercises with China and supports Chinese naval operations in Asian water, just as US does with South Korea, Japan, and other partner countries. The rebooting of coordinated security dialogue known as Quad by US, Japan, India, and Australia has generated some issues, and Russia's longtime strategic partner has now joined an alliance that is aimed against China. US as a potential spoiler. Washington, however, is likely to oppose this new Sino-Russian rapprochement, and the US regards China and Russia both as a security threat to its interests. It also creates problems by creating a new alliance, AUKUS, with the UK and Australia, where they will share military intelligence through operation of nuclear-powered submarines. And then there is the major issue of North Korean security challenge. Russia, following the threat from Pyongyang, US has in 2017 deployed terminal high altitude area defense pad, an anti-ballistic missile system in South Korea, arguing that it will enhance South Korean security. But both China and Russia are very strongly opposed to it because it will provide very sensitive information about these two countries to the US. USA is not an Eurasian power, but its influence in this region is very strong. We can see what is happening in Ukraine at the moment. Washington will likely to use its partnership across the region to slow down or stop the implementation of GPP. In the similar manner, it is trying to stop BRI. The Quad infrastructure, the G7 Back to Better World P3W initiative. In Eurasia, in fact, Turkey, a NATO member, could play a very key role in counterbalancing Russian and Chinese initiatives. Central Asia will be a crucial region for promoting both PAEU and BRI harmonization. US withdrawal from Afghanistan that has led to the return of power of Taliban have further raised concern in Beijing and Moscow about the instability in the region and risk to PAEU and Chinese plan for China Central Asia, West Asia Economic Corridor, which is an integral part of Silk Road Economic Initiative. We may play a bit of role there, but Russia's proposal for a constructive partnership are still a concept. Many steps are required to be taken. Russia's geo-economic projects are always linked to its status in international politics, and search for greater Euro-Asian demonstrate that for Kremlin, foreign economic strategies and international identity are inherently linked. While entrapped by great power nationalism in designing and implementing its strategy, Russia has been able to broker limited but important agreements between Eurasian Economic Union and several Asian countries. The most important of them is the trade agreement recently signed with Vietnam and Iran. And the agreements are of very significant importance. Though the volume of trade is very little, but the EU is now in negotiation with Israel, Egypt, India, Singapore for similar agreements. In 2017 May, the Belt and Road at the Belt and Road Initiative Forum, Putin argued that the Greater Eurasia is not an abstract geopolitical arrangement, but without exaggeration, a truly civilization-wide project looking towards the future. In Lavrov's, Foreign Minister Lavrov's words, in the long run, the Great Eurasian Partnership could become the foundation for a reformed architecture of the continent's security responding to the reality of the 21st century. And in conclusion, I would like to come to what prospects Russia has. I think while Russia may be the architect of GDP, but China will decide the future. President Xi is accommodating Moscow's great power ambition for Beijing. Closer cooperation with Moscow works for the strategic stability in Eurasia. China needs Russia to access the European market as an unimpeded trade and infrastructure connectivity are two goals that President Xi wants to have in Eurasia. 3 of the 4 economic corridors that are part of Silk Road economic belt goes through EAEU. The China-Mongolia corridor, the China-Central Asia-West Asia corridor. On the other hand, improvement in railway transportation in Eurasia are unlikely to challenge the primacy of maritime and air trade, which account for 90% of the volume of trade between China and EU. Still, it provides China with a very important alternative. At the moment, the train links from central China to Düsseldorf take about 16 to 18 days to reach, much lower than the maritime route or air links. So China has now an advantage. All its lighter trade items are traveling through the train. Russia is a vital energy supplier for China. China's ever increasing demands are met through it, and the Chinese participation in Russian energy projects are very crucial at this time when Russia is facing sanctions under US and EU. While China is not an important economic actor in Central Asia at the moment, but very soon it is becoming the major player in Central Asia. Moscow can do little to balance Chinese growing economic influence in Central Asia. Both countries need each other in their joint effort to adjust to the rules of Western-led international order to their advantage. Russia no longer feels isolation from the West, at least for the moment, thanks to Chinese support. However, it is unclear how much longer Russia will tolerate China's rising capabilities and influence in its own perceived sphere of influence. The Kremlin will not be happy with only a symbolic accommodation of its great Eurasian partnership. It may ask China for a more substantial role in connectivity projects. While EAU is an economic integration mechanism that aims to protect Russian-led Eurasia from outside competition, the Belt and Road Initiative is designed to benefit from the economic globalization through connectivity. In the age of globalization and connectivity, other members of EAU will find little economic benefit from a Russia that is in search of import substitution. Here I will end, and thank you very much for your patient listening and participation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Hassan Habib, and thank you for bringing in the China factor. Our next speaker is Dr. Tanveer Khalid. She is the Honorary Secretary of this Institute of International Affairs, and she was also a professor and head of the Department of Political Science in the University of Karachi. She will speak on Russia and the leadership of Vladimir Putin. Dr. Tanveer Khalid.
Thank you. I'm extremely thankful to Dr. Masood Hassan, chairperson of the Pakistan Institute of International Affairs, for providing me the opportunity to speak my views from this august platform. And I would like to say that whatever we're talking of on the issue presently, the issue itself is of great concern as well as grave concern to everybody. And its significance is basically because of its global and regional dimensions and consequences, and a changing foreign policy focus under an assertive leadership in Russia. So for this, theorists and political scientists and analysts have brought forward their approaches, and a better understanding of the present issue depends upon an understanding of all those issues. To many scholars, post-Soviet Russia faces an identity crisis because the Soviet regime had promoted Russia's role in a multinational community of people, but after the breakup of the USSR, it became invalid. Hence, different groups of Russian intellectuals and politicians offered competing answers to questions like, who are we? Where is Russia going? Thus came about the views on choices of strategy for domestic and foreign policy, as well as views on the nation's place in the world. The West was always considered as the main reference point in defining Russia's identity. Russia's relationship with Europe has been a key question since the time of Peter the Great in the late 1600s and early 1700s. Since then, Russian rulers have faced a dilemma in relation to more modernized societies of Western Europe, whether to follow them to advance their country's development or to preserve their own separate values and customs, a dilemma evident in every period of history of Tsarist Russia. Russian intelligentsia has shown a combined feeling of attraction and aversion for Europe, but Vladimir Putin has answered the question of Russia's place in the world and the crucial importance of its relations with the West. In consistency with Russian traditions, Putin's attitude towards the West was ambivalent, reflecting in the internal tensions within the system of values he had chosen. Putin offered and approved an official ideology, but the meaning of that word ideology meant a relatively coherent, emotionally charged, and conceptually interlocking set of ideas available to motivate substantial number of people to action. Putin has sought to reshape reality to fit his values and goals, which in his opinion will guide political leaders in decades ahead. The main basis on which Russians shaped their identity of their society was Western Europe, conceived as the other. During the last years of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev looked towards Western Europe as providing a political and economic model to westernize Soviet institutions, stating that he wanted Russia to be accepted as part of a common European home where commitment to democracy and individual rights was shared by all nations in Europe. Boris Yeltsin, as first president of the independent Russian Federation, in an attempt to oust and outdo Gorbachev, adopted policies by bringing features of Western democracy and capitalism to Russia. Vladimir Putin has repeatedly said that Russia is a European country and has historically shared common values and experiences with other European countries. He has also gone as far as to claim that Russia has moved towards the protection of freedom similar to other European nations in establishing democratic, legal, and civic institutions. He does wish closer institutional linkages between Russia and Europe. And in his opinion, economic strength is the basis of survival in this harsh competition. To be inferior economically is to be vulnerable politically and militarily. Russia can preserve its independence and protect its identity only if its economy becomes one of the most developed in the world, and he focused himself on the goal of making Russia a great economic power on the basis of its vast energy resources. Selected adoption of European institutions will enable Russia to become a stronger, prosperous modern society, which will participate more fully in a globalized world. To Putin, In order to overcome the challenges of globalization, a greater role for the state is imperative. One aspect of globalism is the existence of values that are universal, and commitment to democracy is among those values. Russia has made its choice, in favor of democracy. To the question of how has he reconciled the sport of democracy in a semi-authoritarian political system in Russia, he argues that though the basic principles of democracy have universal validity, their implementation must fit the conditions that are distinctive to his country. The fundamental principles of democracy and its institutions must be adapted to the realities of Russian life, traditions, and history. Thank you. I'm sorry for the disturbance. The fundamental principles of democracy and its institutions must fit to Russian life, its traditions, and history. Before he became president of Russia, he rejected the notion of importing abstract models and schemes from other countries. Protecting Russia's sovereignty is vitally important for Putin because he means to choose his own form of government and development. He denies the right of criticism of foreign governments, of changes in Russian political practices as undemocratic, and intervening in other countries' affairs as against international law. To him, if this happens, it is the 19th century colonialism being replaced by democratization in recent times, because the efforts at spreading democracy by finances is in fact motivated by self-interest of those states who finance it. In Russia, a strong civil society will not take shape unless the state takes the initiative to make that happen. His assessment of the problems facing Russia are fears of disunity in the society, hence there should be basic national values and tasks by the state. The concept of sovereign democracy for Russia was based on the growing stress from colored revolutions in some states of the former Soviet Union, particularly the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004. Europe has come closer to Russia with the expansion of the EU and now includes most of the former communist states of Eastern Europe and 3 states which were republics of USSR. But the government of Russia seeks cooperation as a means of serving economic needs, while the EU has preoccupation with liberal values. Russia will not give up the autonomy of its domestic political structures, which the states of Eastern Europe had done for a united Europe. Russian Federation under Vladimir Putin has changed its course and its foreign policy is redirected, which is because of a mix of internal causes and exogenous factors. Theorists present frameworks in which to fit in some parts of his world for his better understanding. And in this case of Russia, this framework revolves around liberalism and realism. The sources of change should also be analyzed, which are the causes behind the redirection of foreign policy, like a predominant leader, need for domestic restructuring, and a capacity to bear external shocks. In case of Russia, it is wise to see the recurring priorities in Russian foreign policy, where interests and goals have remained consistent since the birth of the post-Soviet state and have been repeated in foreign policy and security documents since 1993. The most persistent is the prioritization of its relations with the CIS to have a zone of influence or a buffer zone around it. Russian policymakers have been influenced by this, but the Kremlin is concerned, and if the CIS were to become westernized, it will protect its zone of privileged interests. This brings Russian policy closer to opposing NATO's eastward expansion, because the West has started to spread democracy by sometimes peaceful means, but by military use of military force as well, and against countries who do not abide by rules of the Western established international order. Although Russia has at times been closer to the West and NATO than it is today, to the point of even considering joining the organization, but the threat of immediate proximity to its borders has been persistently mentioned in its official documents. Since the Gulf War, the West has resorted to force either through NATO or through individual actions. It bombed Serbia in 1999, a close ally in Europe of Russia, to support the secession of Kosovo. Some of NATO's members have engaged in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya to bring about a regime change. It has been incorporating countries that were former Soviet republics, Baltic states, and Poland, which have now become increasingly anti-Russian. If Ukraine were to join NATO, Russia will have to share a 2,000 kilometers long border with NATO, which is something unacceptable because to Russia, NATO has become an offensive organization from a purely defensive body in the Cold War. Russia has always been a defender of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and international law in general, and its own sovereignty and independence against unilateral or multilateral interference in domestic affairs of other states. Putin's war in Georgia and annexation of Crimea broke the commitment, which was an abrupt shift in his foreign policy. Besides, establishment of a missile defense system in Europe can undermine regional and global security by giving undue strategic advantage to those who adopt it. Under Putin, the paramount element of foreign policy has been retrieving and then consolidating its status of great power. In Putin's, thus Russia considers itself equal to the United States and Europe and has no intention of being led by them, and has defended his position as an independent strategic player. It has considered itself as an exceptional country with a special mission, resenting any move by the West which disregards this view. The foreign policy of Russia is current alone after becoming president. This is primarily the notion of great power status, and Russians feel that the world is extremely dangerous. And because the country's geography offers no natural defenses, the only way that Russia can guarantee its security is to have a strong state capable to resort to force to protect its interests and itself. Thus, the unintended and paradoxical consequences of such an idea is personalistic rule. This has been legitimized by Article 80 and 85 of the Constitution of the Russian Federation, giving the president the authority to govern the country's foreign policy. Vladimir Putin exercises enormous amount of personal power because he is able to win over the trust and love of ordinary Russians. The collapse of the Soviet Union was dramatic, but resulted in economic depression, street crimes, and an extremely violent fight among oligarchs for control over Soviet assets, which were being privatized. This was the greatest economic depression in peacetime in modern world history. But because of the personal skills of Putin, a functioning state was reestablished, and he promised Russia's rightful place as an independent great power to the Russian population. Hence, he is the sole decision maker in Russia's foreign and security policy based on what he believes are national interests and on his philosophical interpretation of right and wrong. During his 3 terms as president and during his tenure as prime minister, the changes in Russian policy were not a sudden tailspin. Rather, it was the process, began much earlier, but under Putin, it became much stronger. The first phase of Putin's foreign policy from 2000 to 2001 was characterized by mistrust and antagonism towards the West. because of its role in the CIS and uncertain future of Baltic states, disagreement regarding energy routes, and troubles concerning the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. Putin started friendly relations with China, Cuba, and North Korea, as well as Iraq and Iran, and denounced US actions which had some effect on Russia, which became critical of the US intended withdrawal from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and its plans to build a national missile defense system. The US military intervention in Yugoslavia and talks about NATO's expansion to Eastern Europe irritated his administration. The terrorist attack of September 11 in the United States coincided with his second term, which brought a radical change in Putin's policy, and Russia went from opposing them to a relationship of partnership and trust. This was considered as one of the most pro-Western stances in Russian history, when Putin declared that Russia will give full support to the United States in its war on terror, and former Soviet military bases in Central Asia were made available to US troops. He even went as far as to claim that the decision of US President for a deployment of US missile system was not a threat to Russia's security. He reconsidered Russia's decade-long opposition to NATO's eastward expansion, saying he was keen to strengthen its relationship with NATO and possibly consider joining it as a member. But when the US announced its plan to go to war with Iraq, Putin publicly opposed it, claiming that Russia will veto any US-sponsored Security Council resolution which will authorize the use of force against Saddam Hussein. The renewed bitterness towards US and the West was later transformed into hostility. Putin's criticism went beyond to the United States to include NATO and the EU as well. The Baltic countries went back to being a contentious issue as Russia claimed that if NATO was to extend to these countries, unspecified reactions would follow. When pro-democracy color revolutions began in Ukraine and Kyrgyzstan, Putin considered it a Western plan to install friendly regimes in the CIS and bring a regime change in Russia. Apparently, the radical changes which took place in Putin's foreign policy by offering support to the United States and consider joining NATO were also to make Russia a great power, again to shape and protect the world. But the West would not accept Russia as equal. Hence, Putin went back to a distant, assertive approach. Putin, despite being a strong leader, has to keep into account the way private citizens feel because domestic constraints affect foreign policy. Efforts of the Bush administration to admit Georgia and Ukraine in NATO and deployment of a missile defense system to Poland and the Czech Republic contributed to Putin becoming an aggressive nationalist from a great power activist. Putin has become increasingly dissatisfied at the way the West was behaving in the international arena, asking Russia to join the Western-built world order as a minor partner, something which is unacceptable. But things have become complicated for Russia as energy prices begin to drop, worsening economic conditions and sparking domestic protests. Putin's focus turned towards annexation of Crimea and a military intervention in Syria. Except for war against Georgia in 2008, Putin had avoided military involvement in foreign conflicts. The taking over of Crimea is also believed to be a part of the concept of making Russia a great power. The newly assertive approach in foreign policy remains unchanged, but methods are different. The annexation of Crimea by Putin was due to NATO's expansion, in which if Ukraine joined it as a member, it could encircle Russia and expel its Sevastopol Black Sea fleet, although the base has been guaranteed lease by earlier Russo-Ukrainian treaties to last up to 2040. The possibility that Putin might want to restore Russian borders to those of the Soviet Union. The annexation of Crimea was a response to the fall of government of Yanukovych, an ally of Putin. Russian analysts have continuously pointed that Putin did not get over the loss of prestige at the collapse of the Soviet Union, which he mentioned as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And by annexing Crimea, he was making it impossible for Ukraine to get into NATO or EU anytime soon. It was also an extreme way of telling the West to stay out of Russia's zone of influence. On top of it, he was
Dr. Sara, can you go ahead?
Yes, on top of it, he was also writing what most Russians thought of as a historical wrong, that Crimea should go back to being Russia, Ukraine. Russia under Putin is still a conservative status quo power, and military support and annexation of Crimea is also to bring and give strategic control of many areas extending from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. And to some analysts, economic and political pressures have gained more respect for Putin, but order and prosperity at home and renewed dignity abroad is what his policies are aimed for. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tanveer. Thank you very much for this incisive analysis of Russia, Putin's leadership. And as Putin has said to the world, let Russia be Russia. We have a few minutes left for questions and answers. There is a question from one Mr. Hamid, who says that from the time of the Crimean War, the Russian-Japan War, and the two great wars, Russia has been entangled in the designs of Western imperial powers seeking domination. He further says, Russia has to constantly respond to external pressures and consequent internal pressures, and to deal with the threats it faces from external actors. So he asks, has anything changed? And should it surprise any informed observer that the same old conflict is being played out under different conditions? And the events of the recent past are a reflection of the Russian response to these external pressures. Ambassador Shahid Amin, would you like to reply? It was a very long question. आप unmute करें शायद साहब. Please unmute yourself. Please unmute.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was saying we have not touched on the current situation, which is the Russian military operation in Ukraine, which are not consistent with the question which has been just asked, which suggests that Russia merely reacts to what the West is imposing on it. Yes, in some cases that is true, but Russia intervened in Afghanistan and militarily occupied it. There was no response to any Western action. It was a pure military adventure and expansionist design on the part of Russia. Similarly, in Ukraine today, I think although people have different interpretations, no doubt Russia is very concerned that Ukraine might not become a member of NATO, and their Russian point of view is justified. If Ukraine becomes a member of NATO, it will be a direct threat to Russia. So that much is understandable. But then the way it has opened up a military operation against a neighboring country in violation of so many international laws, it has opened a war without a declaration of war. It has tried to change the regime in Ukraine to, as they are putting it, denazification and whatnot. So in Ukraine, I think Putin has done a number of things which have been, I think, widely criticized in the world, and they have, and the most stringent sanctions have now been placed on Russia I mean, if this continues, we may not see the rise of Russia, we may see the decline of Russia, unless the Ukraine situation can be resolved in the near future through some diplomatic compromise. The answer to that long question is yes, in some cases, Russia has intervened because of the Western pressures, but not all. I mean, for instance, the 1904-1905 war against Japan had nothing to do with Western pressures. It was Russian expansionism which ran into Japanese expansionism. So there have been all different causes, and I think we should. It would be better not to make generalization. Each war has its own explanation.
Ambassador Hassan Habib, would you like to respond to this question?
Yes, yes, ma'am. Thank you very much. I'll slightly disagree with Ambassador Shahid Amin, sir. In recent past, we have been seeing that Russian reactions are almost according to the provocation by the West. Imagine why they walked into Afghanistan and spent long years there at a very heavy cost, and also Crimea, and recently Ukraine. So in recent past, Russia's reaction has been as per the planned provocation by the West. So, and it has a pattern which is being followed everywhere. So in a way, Russia is falling for the traps that the Western provocation have been creating, and it is losing a lot of its resources to that. Imagine a very small neighbor like Ukraine is holding Russia for 1 month with not sizable gain with this huge army. So in a manner, yes, Russia is falling in the trap historically. Thank you.
There is another question. Yesterday, Pakistan's foreign minister was talking with the Russian foreign minister in Beijing and stated that one superpower was trying to stop the Pakistani Prime Minister from visiting Russia. How will this affect Pakistan's foreign policy? Shahid Amin sir?
I think the West and USA were quite unhappy that Prime Minister Imran Khan arrived in Moscow the day Russia opened its military operations against Ukraine, and it had become the big issue for the Western power and maybe for others in the world. But of course, our explanation was that the visit had been arranged some time ago, and it had nothing to do with the Ukraine crisis, and that we are neutral in this particular dispute. This has not exactly pleased the West, but again, India is in the same position. The Western countries have been critical of India for remaining neutral, but I don't think this is something which, on which we should change our stance. Basically, to improve our relations with Russia, I think this trend, which has started in the last few years of greater understanding between Pakistan and Russia, should be maintained. This is in our national interest. Russia is our immediate neighbor. It's a great power. It is in the same region as we are. So we should have much more in common with Russia than faraway countries like USA. So our stance to get closer to Russia in a bilateral context, not in the context of Western and Russian tussle, in which we remain neutral, but the efforts to improve relations between Pakistan and Russia should continue. And our foreign minister's meeting with the Russian foreign minister in China was a welcome development. No doubt Russia has its own interpretation of things, but our policy is clear. We are not taking part, we are not taking sides in the Ukraine issue, and we want to have stronger relationship with Russia while not disturbing our relationship with the West.
Dr. Tanvir Khalid, would you like to respond to?
Madam, thank you. I would like to say that there are certain fundamental or principles which states follow in their dealings with one another. And it doesn't always mean that if you are talking to one state, it is you are hostile to the other. The two states have their own contradictions, have their own fights, have their own interests to look after. And Pakistan is one of those states on the principle of democracy and on the principle of equality in the international community. It is expected that the leading powers must take the lead in providing that equality to all states, big and small alike. So we look forward now, the world is no longer a unipolar world, but the United States has helped so many countries economically and in many other ways to develop them. So we look forward to the United States and other countries, developed countries, and even European powers to come forward with the idea that states which are coming up for economic development, they must be helped, they must be provided the opportunities, and no hostility should be brought against them. Because if you push any country to the wall, reaction and reversion is almost essential. So this is what I feel that Russia is being pushed into. Pakistan's relations with Russia is also as good as it has relations with the United States, with countries of Europe. It accepts or better ties with countries of the Mediterranean, countries in Africa, in America, and South America, and in China. So getting or having talks for improving trade relations with Russia, I don't think that is anything which is opposing the principles of the fundamentals of the international community. It is co-relationship, it is cooperation, and it's for the maintenance of peace and avoiding a war.
I was wondering what the take of our panel is on the sanctions which have been slapped on Russia because of the Ukraine war. What effect will it have on the Russian economy? Shahid sir?
Well, I think it is crippling Russia. There are these stringent sanctions in history, actually, and Russia is bound to suffer not only in the immediate term, but also over a longer period of time. Of course, we can say there is a mutual dependence of Russia and Europe in terms of supply of gas. That Europe needs the gas and oil, and Russia has certainly the gas. So there is a mutual dependence. But just now, Europe has more or less stopped that kind of linkage with Russia. And the other sanctions, including those affecting Russian trade, Russian currency, you can see how the ruble has crashed in the last few weeks. They are going to affect Russia quite badly. I really think Russia will have to seriously reevaluate the wisdom of its current militant policies of using armed force in Ukraine to impose its own preferred solutions, because the cost which the West has imposed is probably greater than whatever advantages Russia can derive from imposing its will in Ukraine. An early solution of the Ukraine crisis is probably in the interest of Russia. And I think presently negotiations are going on, although they have not been so successful. But it is my sense that some kind of a diplomatic solution is likely to be found in the near future rather than in the distant future.
Ambassador Hassan Habib, would you like to respond?
Yes, thank you, ma'am. It is true, Mr. Shahid Amin has said so, that the cost now faced by Russia through sanctions is, I think, more than what the Russia had thought. Russia had in place a mechanism to balance it, which too bad it never worked. Russia was trying to balance the currency value through gold. It did not work. So in a way, Russia had suffered a lot in 1 month than it had. According to a very conservative estimate, Russia had lost 10 years of its development in 1 month. So that amount of cost is good as well as bad. Good in the sense that it will stop others to aggress on their neighbors, and bad in the sense that if it is only targeted against countries that are not part of Western alliance, then it is very selective and discriminatory. So let's hope that Russia takes a lesson and settles its ambition versus Ukraine. And Ukraine should also learn a lesson that aggression or its plans to be part of Western alliance would have a very high cost. Thank you.
Dr. Tanveer Khalid, you can have the last word. I said you can have the last word, Dr. Saiba.
I would say we should leave
in the name of
Russia
peace and
do
in
what
the
it
interest of
thinks
its own
best
people,
in the interest of its
and
own
it is
people,
not going to
and it is not going to violate
international
principles of international law.
So we believe, we think
So we
that
think the West should also do the same. Go by principles of international law.
That
That is not to make a state suffer in dignity, because we know and we have seen in the 20th century, indignity and disrespect to a nation results in something which is just the opposite of what is being thought of. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Saiba. We have run out of time, although there are a couple of other questions, but I will leave it at that. We decided to hold this webinar because we have heard a lot about, from foreign scholars about Russia, about the Soviet Union. And I thought that we would be doing something useful if we could have a perspective that was specifically from Pakistan, because Pakistan has been trying to diversify its foreign policy. And we have seen recently that it has reached out to Russia. There have also been military exercises with Russia. And we hope that, as the panelists said, Russia is located in our own region, and it is but natural that we should have a cooperative relationship with a state, a country as large and important as Russia. I will wind up now and thank all the panelists for their very incisive presentations. And I will end with a statement that I find in the chat section. Putin evidently forgot Lord Ismay's explanation for the creation of NATO, which was to keep Russia out, America in, and Germany down, in Europe, of course. So I bid you all farewell and thank you again on behalf of the Pakistan Institute of International Affairs. We will transcribe the proceedings of this webinar and publish them in our journal, Pakistan Horizon. Thank you, Shahid Saab. Thank you, Mr. Hassan, Ambassador Hassan Habib. Thank you, Dr. Tanveer Khalid.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.